The Byzantine emperor summoned a heretic to the palace for a private conversation. He acted fascinated. He asked questions. He listened carefully. The whole time, a scribe was hidden behind a curtain, writing down every word. That confession would send the man to the fire, but it wouldn't stop what was coming. In the 10th century, Bulgaria was a young Christian kingdom. Tsar Boris I had negotiated baptism for his people in 863, playing Rome and Constantinople against each other until the Byzantines won the deal. The religion arrived from the top down. Priests spoke Greek. Peasants understood nothing. By the reign of Tsar Peter I, who ruled from 927 to 969, a movement had begun spreading through the Bulgarian countryside. Quietly, through village priests and traveling teachers, with no churches and no crosses, and a theology that said the entire visible world was made by the devil. The Orthodox Church called it heresy. Historians call it Bogomilism, and for 5 centuries it would spread across the Balkans and into the heart of Western Europe, surviving 2 empires, a crusade, and the Inquisition, before it finally went quiet. Almost everything we know about the Bogomils comes from people who hated them. That's the first thing to keep in mind. The earliest record naming the movement's founder appears in a treatise written by a Bulgarian church official named Cosmas the Priest, sometime after 969. Writing in Old Church Slavonic, Cosmas identifies the heretic as a village priest. The title was pop, meaning an ordinary parish clergyman, not a senior figure, who went by the name Bogomil. The name means dear to God. Cosmas, with obvious contempt, suggested the man's real name should have been Bogomil, unworthy of God's compassion. That's the level of hostility we're working with in our sources. Cosmas was not an outside observer. He was an enemy writing a polemic. What Cosmas describes, and what historians largely credit as reliable in its general outline, is a theology rooted in dualism. The Bogomils taught that there was one good God who created spirit, light, and the invisible world. But the visible world, earth, flesh, suffering, death, churches, thrones, taxes, was not God's creation. It was the work of a fallen angel. Depending on the branch of Bogomilism, that fallen figure was called Satanael, or Lucifer, described as God's elder son who had rebelled and fashioned the material universe as a prison for angelic souls. Human bodies, in this view, were cages. The physical world was a trap, and the institutions built on top of that world, the church with its gold crosses and land holdings, the emperor collecting tribute, the bishop demanding tithes from people who barely understood the liturgy, were all instruments of the fallen order. This was not abstract theology. In 10th century Bulgaria, the Orthodox Church owned large estates. It collected income from peasants. Services were in Greek. The Bogomil teachers offered something entirely different. A version of Christianity in a language people understood, rejecting the gold and the hierarchy and the pageantry, saying that all of it had been built on a lie. Patriarch Theophylact of Constantinople, writing to Tsar Peter around 940 to 950, flagged the movement in a letter. He described it as a mixture of older heresies, specifically Manichaeism and Paulicianism, a dualist sect from Armenia that Byzantine emperors had resettled in Thrace in the 8th century. That transplanted community had been quietly influencing the Balkans for generations before Bogomil the priest gave the movement its name. By the time Cosmas put pen to parchment, it had already spread across the Bulgarian countryside. And Tsar Peter, the good Christian Tsar in Cosmas's phrasing, apparently couldn't stop it.
To understand why this movement terrified two empires, you have to understand what the Bogomils were asking their followers to do, and what they were asking them to refuse. No baptism by water. They called it meaningless ritual. No Eucharist, the bread and wine of the Orthodox and Catholic Mass, because matter was corrupt and no physical object could carry divine grace. No cross. The instrument of Christ's death was a tool of torture, not a holy symbol. No church building, no altar, no icons, no incense. To a medieval bishop, this was not a minor theological disagreement. Every item on that list was a revenue stream, an institutional claim, a form of social control. The church baptized your children. It administered your last rites. It owned the land your village sat on. Strip all of that away, and you hadn't just changed the liturgy. You had dismantled the entire system that made the church visible, powerful, and present in every moment of ordinary life. They rejected the Old Testament almost entirely, calling it the scripture of the fallen Creator, not the good God. They accepted the New Testament, particularly the Gospel of John, a text that later circulated in Cathar communities in France. The Interrogatio Johannes, or Secret Supper, is believed to reflect Bogomil theology, preserved, ironically, by the Inquisition as evidence against heretics. The movement divided its members into two tiers. The outer circle, ordinary believers, could live something close to a normal life. The inner tier, called the elect or the perfects, lived with strict asceticism. No meat, no wine, no marriage, no sexual relations, no accumulation of wealth. They traveled in pairs. They prayed constantly. Men and women could both enter the elect. In a medieval society where women had almost no institutional religious standing, that mattered. What the movement did not do, at least according to most of the evidence, was organize armed resistance. The Bogomils were not a military faction. They did not build armies. Their threat to the imperial order was ideological. A theology that made the church's wealth illegitimate, the emperor's authority questionable, and the entire feudal structure a construction of the devil. For the clergy and the court, that was more than enough to be dangerous. Bulgaria fell to Byzantine conquest in 1018 under Emperor Basil II. The empire absorbed the Bulgarian lands, and in doing so, absorbed the Bogomil problem. For decades, imperial authorities largely left the movement alone, possibly judging it a local nuisance or underestimating its reach. They miscalculated. By the late 11th century, Bogomil teachers had spread into Constantinople itself, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, a city of perhaps 500,000 people. They were finding converts not just among the poor, but among educated Byzantines, merchants, intellectuals, members of the aristocracy. The theology of the fallen world had a certain appeal to people who had watched the empire lose ground to the Seljuk Turks, survive a brutal civil war, and see its church entangled in political intrigue. Emperor Alexius I Komnenos, the same emperor who
whose call for military aid from the West helped trigger the First Crusade in 1096, eventually decided the Bogomil presence in his capital required a response. His officers tortured a Bogomil named Deblatius until he revealed the identity of the movement's leader. The name was Basil, a monk, a physician, a man who had been teaching within the sect since around 1070. And he had structured his movement in a way Alexius found alarming. Basil had selected 12 disciples, deliberately presenting them as apostles, a direct parallel to the structure of the early church. That was not accident. That was a rival system. Alexius did not arrest Basil immediately. He had a more careful plan in mind.
Our primary account of what happened next comes from Anna Komnena, Alexios's daughter, who wrote about her father in a work called The Alexiad. Anna wrote to honor her father, and historians use her account with appropriate caution. She had strong reasons to paint Alexios as shrewd and righteous, but the broad outlines of the story are accepted. Alexios summoned Basil to the imperial palace under the pretense of a private meeting. He told Basil he was deeply interested in the Bogomil teachings. He appeared sympathetic, even curious. He asked Basil to explain the theology fully. Basil complied. He spoke at length about the dualist cosmology, the rejection of the orthodox sacraments, the nature of the fallen world, the structure of his community. Behind a curtain, an imperial scribe recorded every word. The confession was complete. Alexios then dropped the pretense. Basil was condemned before the Patriarch of Constantinople, Nicholas III, along with his 12 disciples. He refused to recant. According to Anna Komnena, Alexios then ordered 2 large fires built, one with a cross in front of it, one without. Every person suspected of Bogomil membership was brought before both fires and told to choose which one to walk toward. Those who went to the cross were counted as Christians. Those who moved toward the unmarked fire were identified as Bogomils. Basil was burned at the stake. The date is debated, around 1111 or 1118, depending on the source. It was a rare and extreme sentence. Byzantine authorities did not commonly execute heretics by burning. The severity of the response tells us something about how seriously the imperial court took Basil's network by that point. But there was a problem Alexios could not burn away. While Byzantine authorities were managing Bogomilism in the east, the theology had already been moving west for decades. Teachers, travelers, traders, the vectors are not always clear, but by the 12th century, dualist communities were appearing in northern Italy, in the Rhineland, in Flanders, and most significantly in the Languedoc region of southern France. The French called these Western dualists by several names: Cathars, from the Greek word for pure, Albigensians, after the town of Albi, and Bougre, a French corruption of Bulgarians. That last name was not an ethnic slur, it was an acknowledgement. The French clergy recognized where these ideas had come from. By the early 13th century, a historian looking at a map of Europe could trace a chain of dualist communities running from the Black Sea to the Atlantic. Bogomils and Paulicians in the Balkans, Cathar communities in Italy and France. Scholars debate how much of this was direct organizational connection versus parallel development. But a documented council held at Saint Félix de Caraman in southern France around 1167
included a Bogomil bishop named Nicetas, who traveled from the Balkans to help organize the Western Cathar churches. That was not a coincidence. The Catholic Church watched this spread with growing alarm. Pope Innocent III, elected in 1198, spent years trying to convert the Cathars of the Languedoc through Franciscan and Dominican missionaries. When that failed, and when a papal legate named Peter of Castelnau was murdered in 1208 under circumstances that implicated the local nobility, Innocent declared a formal military campaign against the people of the region. The Albigensian Crusade began in 1209. Over the next 2 decades, towns in southern France were burned, populations were killed, and a new institution was established to locate and prosecute surviving heretics. That institution was the Inquisition.
Almost every account of what they believed, what they actually thought, taught, and practiced, was written by their enemies. Cosmas the priest wrote a polemic. Anna Komnena wrote to justify her father. Euthymius Zygobanus, the theologian who examined Basil on behalf of Alexios and wrote the most detailed Byzantine account of Bogomil beliefs, was explicitly tasked with documenting the heresy in order to refute it. The one surviving text that may reflect actual Bogomil theology, the Interrogatio Johannis, the Secret Supper, was preserved by the Inquisition as evidence. We are reading it through the archive of the institution that was trying to eradicate it. Stefan Nemanja of Serbia, around 1180, summoned a general assembly of his court specifically to deal with the Bogomils. He ordered their leaders burned and their books destroyed. In Bulgaria, Tsar Boril's Synodikon of 1211 formally condemned the movement and catalogued its errors. These documents survive. The Bogomils' own writings, with rare exceptions, do not. What we have is a photograph of the Bogomils taken entirely by people who needed them to look a certain way. Scholars like Dmitry Obolensky and Stephen Runciman, who wrote major studies of the Bogomils in the 20th century, built their analysis on this deeply compromised source space. Modern historians continue to debate how much of the radical theology attributed to the Bogomils, the full dualism, the rejection of marriage and procreation, was genuine doctrine, and how much was the standard heresiological accusation applied to any group that challenged church authority. The Bosnian Church, for example, was labeled Bogomil for centuries, by Rome and later by historians. Modern scholarship has largely rejected that equation. The evidence suggests the Bosnian Church was a separate indigenous Christian movement with its own distinct practices, not a dualist sect at all. The label stuck because it was useful, not because it was accurate. The Bogomils vanished. Bulgaria fell to the Ottomans in 1393. Byzantine power collapsed in 1453. The Cathar movement in southern France was extinguished by Crusade and Inquisition over the course of the 13th and 14th centuries. The grave markers, the stechzi, the carved stone slabs found in Bosnia and northern Greece, are almost all that's left of a world that believed the visible earth was a mistake. But notice what was required to silence them. 2 empires, a crusade launched by a pope, an inquisition that kept running for centuries, an enormous apparatus of detection, interrogation, and execution, all to stop communities that gathered outside official churches, without altars, icons,
or the sacramental system the medieval church considered essential? The question historians still argue over is a straightforward one with no clean answer. How much of what we know about the Bogomils is what they actually believed? And how much is what their persecutors needed the world to think they believed? If you want to understand the full answer to that, you need to look at the one institution that preserved their most sacred text while hunting them to extinction. That's the Inquisition.